Hello, welcome. Welcome you all to the Josephine Soul Culture and Ethics Lecture. This year is also the 50th anniversary of CGST, and so we have the anniversary. The theme of the anniversary is a mission and beyond. To work with this theme, or to cohere with this theme. So this year our Josephine Soul Lectures own title is Navigating the Dynamics of Intercultural Interactions. A lot of inter, you will hear a lot of inter in the talk. And so that's why this year we invite 4 different speakers from 4 corners of the earth in order to talk about the intercultural aspects of our Christian faith. Today is the 3rd lecture. Just in case you did not come to our 2 lectures, previous lecture, just like to tell you the Josephine Soul Culture and Ethics Lecture is supported by the Josephine Soul Fund. And Josephine Soul is really a prophetic voice in Hong Kong during the 70s and 80s. She died when she was 45, but she was a legend when she passed away at 45 already. I remember as a young Christian, I read her autobiography called Death Be Not Proud. She has cancer since she was 26, and she was sick during long periods of her life. But even in her sickness, she served the Lord. She found a magazine in Hong Kong. She found another Christian magazine in Taiwan. She found another magazine in Singapore. Every time when she's sick, she's supposed to take a rest, she will find a magazine. She's really an amazing lady. And she has a great heart for the culture, how to transform Hong Kong culture with the Christian faith. And that's why this series of lecture was established to remember her. And the series also concentrates on relating faith to the cultures of our time. So today we are honored, wrong button. So today we are honored to have Professor Darrell Jackson to be our speaker, and then our own Johnson Yip will be the responder. Professor Darrell Jackson is also the principal of Whitley College in Melbourne. He's also the supervisor for our vice president, Reverend Chu. So he's very important, owing to Professor Jackson, our vice president, get his PhD. According to the website, Whitley College is kind of like a seminary that emphasizes multicultural. Even if you go to their website, they will emphasize it's a Baptist its heritage is Baptist, but it also emphasizes multicultural dimension. And Dr. Jackson is the principal, and he also teaches subjects in theological methodology. And he has lots of cross-cultural experience. He will mention some of it in his lecture. And then our respondent today is Dr. Johnson Yip. The other respondents, the 2 respondents yesterday, they are from the theology faculty. But, Bible is very important, so we have to get a biblical professor to be one of the respondents. So Dr. Johnson Yip is one of our assistant professor in biblical studies. He is also an expert in Ezekiel studies. So without further, and I'm the chairperson, okay, can you believe it? Okay, without further ado, I'll give the time to Dr. Jackson.
I still have a memory of approximately 5 years ago being asked by Dr. Chu, your vice president, if I would be interested in joining you for the 45th lecture or associated with the 45th anniversary of the school. And of course, that was the year that COVID shut down the world, we could say. And so my expected trip to Hong Kong in January did not happen. I was due to be in Italy, I think in March. And of course, in Europe at least, COVID really began to emerge in one of the ski resorts in Italy. And gradually, as the world closed down, my itinerary for that year just came to a halt. And I realized I had a very significant financial investment in the national airline carrier Qantas, which held approximately $12,000 to $15,000 on my behalf for the next 2 years. But what a year that was, and how things have changed in ways for the good and sometimes not for the good. And I know that you're also dealing with some of that now. But it is a joy, and I'm grateful to President Bernard and also to Vice President Michael and your senior staff and faculty and colleagues for all of the hard work that I know that you've put into this particular gathering. I have to say that I suspect that in some way you had prayed hard and sought guidance as to who you ought to invite. And it seems that you might well know your four speakers better than we know ourselves. For the very simple reason that as I was sitting on the airplane flying up from Melbourne, as I read through the papers of my colleagues, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck beginning to rise, because I thought this is going to be such an exciting engagement and exchange together, because so many of the themes that we're dealing with are similar and overlap. And so it's a real joy, a genuine joy to be here, to make new friends and also to reacquaint myself with a former student and a good friend. So thank you for the invitation and this opportunity. I can say that since 2003 I've been researching migration and diaspora in Europe. Along with the churches of Europe, I professionally spent 3 years working for approximately 150 church denominations and mission organizations in Europe, trying to understand the impact that migrant Christianity, particularly, but also other forms of migration, were having upon the churches of Europe in terms of their welfare provision, in terms of the nature and composition of the churches, in terms of their ministry, and in terms of their mission. Of course, that involves a typical range of areas of study, including the study of statistics, demographics, stories and history. But in 2013, as we were preparing for the second edition of what became a 3-edition series of volumes co-authored with an Italian sociologist of religion, a critic of our work, a kindly critic of our work, approached us and said, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Passarelli, we've enjoyed reading your work. It's been a really helpful resource for us as the church Christian denominations of Europe. But where is the voice of the migrant in your work? It was a really helpful, and the challenge still lives with me. And since that time, I have sought to recognize my own location as an observer of migration, particularly as a European observer of migration, and sought to pay much closer attention to the experience, the lived experience of the migrants whose stories I am trying to observe and listen to and learn from, sometimes attempt to present and represent. Now, it's likely that many of you will have already realized that I do not speak with an Australian accent. Though I am a citizen now of Australia, I am of British origin and readily identify as European. And by identifying in this way, I just want to make it very clear that I have to acknowledge the privilege that is frequently associated with being both white and male and European. It's important, I think, to name that today in this context where so much of what we've already heard constitutes as normativity or of universal theology is nothing other than contextual forms of European theology. It's particularly important for me as a missiologist, and we've already had reference to the work of Andrew Walls, to acknowledge his own insight that there has been, certainly in the course of our lifetime, a reversal of mission movement, whereas previously movement in mission had been from the West to the rest, to use a very simplistic shorthand. Walls draws our attention to the movement from the rest to the West. Now, there are, of course, many anxieties associated with that. But one of the things that I welcome this movement for is that this movement does not so much represent the de-Christianization of Europe, but the de-Europeanization of Christianity. Now, historically, of course, migration within the European continent spans many, many centuries, whether it involves Celtic peoples, peoples of the Roman Empire, Germanic peoples, Scandinavian peoples, the Spanish and Portuguese emigration to the Americas. Despite its history of migration, a Eurocentric perspective frequently fails to recognize that migration and diaspora have always been global phenomena, and the story needs to be told from a different place. Crisis, constraint, and conflict are certainly drivers of migration. It's frequently a result of cultural, social, technological, or indeed religious innovation. Think Protestant Reformation and the eventual discovery amongst Protestants of a sense of call and vocation to Christian mission, particularly overseas Christian mission. And yet, however, the innovations that frequently accompanied European migration were not always welcome. And so as a European studying migration in Europe in 2012, with my family, we became economic migrants. And we took up a position in Sydney, Australia, working for the Baptist Theological College in Sydney, which is where, of course, Michael eventually came to join us as a student. Australia is an immigrant nation. All non-Indigenous theologies are consequently the theologies of immigrants who have brought that theology with them. And so this afternoon, from within that context of migration, I also use the word diaspora, partly to keep the debate alive about what those two terms might signify, rather than too quickly narrowing down on one. I intend to present relevant themes from the work of 4 migrant theologians, and I hope that you will appreciate their perspective and what they bring to their theologizing as migrant theologians in Australia. One of them is mainland Chinese, another is Samoan, another is Sri Lankan, and a fourth is a European. One of them is a former PhD student of mine, 2 of them are colleagues in different ways, and another is a well-known local theologian. But before doing so, let me just briefly outline some historical and demographic features of the diaspora or migrant communities in Australia. Just as with parts of the USA and Canada, institutional Christianity arrived with the first British colonizers, particularly in Sydney in 1788. And not long after that, migration was accelerated by the discovery of gold in many of the parts of Australia, particularly in the state now of Victoria, north of Melbourne. And this brought with it a new wave of non-English colonizers or residents, if you like, including many Chinese who came to work in the gold fields in search of wealth. And so when Dr. Chu and I began to explore what he was discovering, we came to realize that, in fact, for many of the Chinese Christian communities, there were certainly, as with the USA, 5th generation Chinese Christians present in Australia. By June of 2022, there were approximately 600,000 Chinese-born people resident in Australia, 7.8% of the population. It's the third largest group of overseas-born residents after the UK and India. Samoans first began arriving in Australia in the early 20th century. The Wesleyan mission to Samoa from 1828 onwards saw, of course, many Samoans come to faith and seek theological training, and some of those found advanced theological training in Australia. However, by 1901, Australia had introduced legislation which led to their deportation. They became unwelcome. And in fact, the restrictions also around Chinese residents in Australia. They had the right to remain, but the moment they left, there was no right to return. And so this caused an exit, particularly for the Samoans, of significant numbers. It saw the deportation of about 7,500 to 8,000 Samoans before the 1921 census. However, today, approximately 24,000 Samoans live in Australia. Sri Lankans in Australia have been present for a much shorter period, but they now represent just about 2% of Australia's overseas-born population, a total of about 145,000 Sri Lankans. And about a quarter of the Sri Lankans identify as Christian. Now, in 2019, to come back to the question about, well, what about the European who's doing his migrant theology in Australia? In 2019, I was invited to write a chapter called Theology in Australia for the Christianity in Oceania volume that tried to identify Christian faith in the Pacific and in that part of the world that we often call Oceania, including Australia and New Zealand. In the research for that chapter, I found a relative absence of anything that one might call contextual theology in Australia. It was largely derivative of theologies from Europe and of theologies from North America. That observation had been made in 1977 by a chap called Richard Campbell, but my research essentially demonstrated that there'd been little development or progress made since 1977. However, I was able and overjoyed in one sense to engage with the work of a more contextual theologian in Australia called Chris Budden, and his work is one I will return to later. And he makes a challenging claim in his work. And it was a confronting claim, and he argues in that book that most contemporary theologians in Australia, whatever theology they're doing, contextual or imported or otherwise, is a theology that is done in the face of claims of indigenous people, that is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, that they knew God in some way before the invaders brought the gospel. Now, I refrain here from engaging with this particular indigenous claim, but indeed, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are indeed Australia's first peoples, First Nations peoples, if you like. And so the theology in my paper is also a second peoples theology, practiced on land, not as guest, but as invader. All of my theology in Australia is practiced in the light of a deeply fractured relationship with its traditional custodians. I am and always will be a migrant European theologian in Australia. So let me turn to the work of my four migrant theological colleagues, and in doing so, again seek to dethrone the Eurocentric theologies through reflecting on the phenomenon of emergent migrant theology in Australia. As I said, I want to outline the work of four colleagues, four theologians representing the Chinese, Samoan, Sri Lankan, and European heritage that has shaped them and forms them. Now, I'm aware that discussion of the work of others can be a fraught exercise in terms of presentation and representation, and I'm also aware that each of them identifies with the labels of migrant and diasporan in different ways. They don't all own them in quite the way I may appear to use it of them, but I use it nevertheless to try and capture something of this as a phenomenon that we're seeking to identify. Now, after introducing their work, I want to, in reflecting on the lived experience of what does it mean to observe the theology of 4 living, breathing theologians in Australia, what do I then do with that in the face of the Indigenous claim, but also in trying to make better sense of the way to frame that experience? And in this respect, I look to the work of a philosopher of motion called Thomas Nail, who works at the University of Denver, as he attempts to understand what is the impact on the world around us today of the phenomenon of motion, of movement, the movement of people. And how can we use this work to try and better understand the phenomenon that I want to introduce you to as represented by these 4 particular theologians. Nail's work has been really helpful for me because his argument is that the movement of people is the primary constitutive motive or power for stasis. So he says when we talk about migration, we so often look at it through the perspective of the nation state, how it impacts the nation state, and why it should be resisted by the nation state, because it's potentially undermining of the nation state. But Nail says, actually, if we look at the phenomenon of migration through the movement of people, we're able to see it's actually the very movement of those people that leads to forms of social, political, communal stability before there's another movement. And so this sense of the motion being primary, I found his work particularly helpful, and maybe you'll be thinking, oh, well, he's a missiologist, he's likely to do that. And that's why I do. I find his work really helpful, because it puts in primary pole position the actual movement of the people that I'm particularly interested in. So let me turn first of all to the work of a mainland Chinese migrant who finds herself in Melbourne and now having to reflect on the experience of being a migrant theologian in Australia and the impact of these 2 realities, her mainland Chinese heritage and her Australian experience, as it takes shape in her work. Zhao Liang arrived in Australia in the early 1990s, and her focus for the focus for her work has been very much around poetry and theology. And so her doctoral thesis, published by Brill, sets up a dialogue between the poetry of a particular and well-known poet from mainland China and the Gospel of Luke. And in her work, she engages with this self-awareness of being migrant, of being in diaspora, of being away from a homeland which is no longer home, but equally being in a home that isn't describable as a homeland. So she lives this somewhat tensive experience. And in recognizing who she is, she comes to elements of what it meant to have a homeland and engages as a migrant Chinese theologian in a certain level of soul-searching as she engages with the gospel of Jesus through this contextual poetic lens, as she describes it. Themes of home and homelessness are central to her work. It's expressed poetically. Much of her theology is done poetically. And it reflects on a journey that begins in lament, is followed by soul-searching, and culminates in a return that, quotes, integrates Chinese poetic tradition and Christian theology. Poetry enables Yang to express her lived human experience in a way that frequently eludes the rational capture or expression of some of the theological formulation that she's also working with. More significantly, for Yang, her poetry and theology present an epistemological pathway towards God. God can be encountered, expressed, understood, not just theologically, but through poetry. Significantly for Yang, this enables her to abandon self to the everyday experience of what she describes as the eschatological reality of God's presence in the new creation. She signals her appreciation of the characterization of a scholar called Marcel that human beings are homo viator, human beings on the road, on the journey. Yet nevertheless, she shares her pain of dislocation from her homeless homeland and of finding her place with the displaced identity of the diaspora community in which she now lives in Melbourne. Her journey suggests a trajectory for a Chinese poetic theology of displacement, in which discipleship becomes a letting go of the past and a moving towards the future. Now, perhaps more prosaically, Yang also makes use of the steamboat in one of her works as not just a metaphor, but as a resource for understanding theologically who she is and her place in the traditional family and community, but also in the new community which she now finds herself in. So Yang harnesses the value of the steamboat meal to explore genealogy, family relationships, status, the place in the community, home and harmony, and hospitality. Yang suggests that the sharing of the steamboat meal is, quote, a return to the place of home. However, she lives in this tensive moment. She appreciates so much of what the steamboat signifies and reminds her of, and the traditions that it calls her back to. And yet, she is a theologian in dialogue with the Gospel of Luke. And in the Gospel of Luke, she encounters a different kind of feast, which challenges some of the ways in which the steamboat excludes some and includes others. The way in which the steamboat reinforces traditions which can sometimes become oppressive and abusive. And she challenges this from the perspective of the feast, the kingdom feast that she reads about in Luke's Gospel. Luke, who describes a Jesus who foresees a table of the kingdom of God that calls everybody home, the lost, the marginalized, even those who don't understand our table rules. Who knew that there are 2 sets of chopsticks to accompany every meal? And I was told that's somewhat unique to Hong Kong, I believe. I'm familiar with using 1 set, but to use 2, thankfully not at the same time, that was a challenge. Yang suggests that the table of a kingdom is a table for all, a home for all. Let me turn to the work of a Samoan Australian who reads the book of Ecclesiastes as the work of a skeptical diasporan, and let me say more about that immediately. Brian Collier is a second-generation Australian Samoan. His diaspora theology informs his 2021 PhD, which is a reading of Ecclesiastes from his diasporic location. For the Samoan, the concept of the Maota Tau Ave captures the idea that the Samoan is part of a culture that takes his or her house with them. That's what this word means, the house that you take with you. And so the Samoan, driven, indeed driving on the moana, the sea, the ocean, uses the sea and the ocean not as a barrier, but as a way to do the journeying. For the Samoan, for the Pacific Islander, the sea is not the barrier, but it's the invitation to journey, to cross the waves. And Collier takes this idea of moving with the sense of this home, this house that's being carried to a new place, and in that place, having to negotiate this again, deeply tensive experience of being in critical dialogue, skeptical dialogue with the inherited tradition that has shaped him, his heritage, but also equally skeptical about what the modern Australian context offers. Never fully accepting of either, critical of each and of both. And he allows this skepticism to rest and to sit with him. And in doing so, he asks the question, as we read the book of Ecclesiastes, the work of Kohelet, its supposed author, we find a certain level of skepticism about much of life. And Brian Collier says, isn't this the very lot of the theologian in exile? And it allows him to suggest that the work of Ecclesiastes, the work of Kohelet, is indeed a work written from the context of exile, of diaspora with his Jewish people. And Brian Collier does this because of his own lived experience as a theologian in diaspora, in migration, experiencing this skepticism towards those things that have both shaped him and also which he encounters anew and afresh. Collier must fit his ma'ota, his house, into the new homeland. Kohelet must seek wisdom in his new place. However, it calls for a reimagining of cultural mandates in the new land, a fact that Collier is very aware of in the face of significant Pacifica theologians, who call their communities to think as islanders. And Collier resists that initial tendency to do so because he's in a new location. His ma'ota is in a different place, and he must do his theology in that new place. Recognizing, cognizant of his Pacific heritage, but in this new place. He lives in this new Australian context. How this is done is important. Collier cannot simply import an immutable, essentialist version of the ma'ota. Through the Samoan conversational practice of talanoa, he is able to disrupt the traditional ma'ota and critique potential corruptions of ma'ota in the diaspora. Now, talanoa is a particularly Samoan form of dialogue. It's done in community. It involves, as other forms of narrative involve, a story, the telling of a story, the sharing of the story, and then the subsequent conversation. It could take days, it could take weeks. But this is how gradually the diasporan theologian begins to make sense of that particular place that their ma'ota, their house, is now located. And so talanoa for Collier has the power to disrupt, both to dislocate and to relocate the authority, the status, and the power that is part of his inherited island heritage. His thinking reshapes and critiques land normative theological metaphors in which oceans are chaotic with no intrinsic value. They're dangerous places. Those of you who are biblical theologians might recall the Germanic notions of Chaoskampf, that sense that the ocean is chaotic. These are the primal images that we read about and are captured by books such as the book of Genesis, perhaps even the book of Jonah. But these experiences for the Pacific Islander seem very foreign, because for them the ocean is friend, the ocean is the highway, the ocean is the journey. This is a fascinating reversal of some of our inherited notions of reading Scripture. And it's an interesting reminder that there is something about oceans that sit within the creative purposes of God that cannot simply be dismissed as those things to be subdued. My third migrant theologian is indeed the work of one of my PhD students, Kamal Weerakun. Kamal is a first-generation Sri Lankan migrant with mixed Tamil and Sinhalese parentage. And it's always amused me somewhat that as a younger Christian, kind of around about the age of 5 or 6, he moved to Australia with his parents and has subsequently become Presbyterian. I'm a Baptist. I don't understand how a Sri Lankan becomes a Presbyterian. It seems, it just crashes all of my boxes. But Kamal has begun to own this identity. And then as he looks around at other Sri Lankan Christians, his interest grew in terms of how do we position ourselves as Sri Lankan Christians from these 4 different Christian traditions, which were first brought to Sri Lanka and then were exported from Sri Lanka then to Australia. And so he was fascinated to talk to young Christian adults from these 4 Christian groups. One of them was an AFES-related group, so the Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students. There was an Anglican parish, and several others. And through his doctoral studies, he actually wished to remain maximally theological and yet maximally practical. Now that might sound a little unusual for some Reformed scholars, but that was key to his PhD project. He wanted to be attentive to the lived experience of Sri Lankans who were navigating their Christian identity in Australia, but also wanted to do this as a Reformed theologian. That's not my tradition, but I said to him, Kamal, to be of any use to your Presbyterian Reformed community, you must think, study, and work as a Reformed scholar. He did. Kamal is interested in how Christian traditions from Europe took root in India initially, then Sri Lanka, and have been subsequently transplanted into Australia. He talks about the ways that these transplanted Christian communities are an expression of the way that contemporary globalization makes diversity, consequently hybridization, normal in his view. He interviewed Sri Lankan and some Indians who identify as Tamil in Australia and spent a long while trying to understand how they position themselves. You know, they'll say things like, well, you know, I'm Sri Lankan, but I'm not like the rest of the people of church. Or they're very aware that they're Sri Lankan when they go to school or university. I know I'm different, I feel different. So I was interested in the maneuvers, the linguistic maneuvers that the Sri Lankan people he was talking to were putting in place to describe how they understood themselves in contrast or alongside and with others. And Weerakun used this to better understand how people position themselves. And he says, look, whilst their reported acts and statements of identification or alienation in the migrant context of Australia might not be as predictable as they might be in their traditional homelands, so Sri Lankans in Sri Lanka, Lankans, Sinhalese, Tamils, very clear about who they are. The community, the way that the community represents itself has a high degree of homogeneity. He says, in the migrant context, whilst they may not be as predictable as they might be, their acts of self-identification are still patternable. We can still see patterns to the way they describe themselves, to the way they position themselves over and against, alongside with others in the Australian community. He says, cultural hybridity does not liquidate the reality or value of knowing oneself as a member of a community with a traditioned identity. Now, his interview subjects position themselves relative to other, quote, South Asians, thank you, Daniel, and other Australians. He suggests that their reported statements of alienation and identification are hybridizing maneuvers that reveal commonly occurring patterns used by his interviewees to position themselves in the migrant context of Australia. He used the particular work of a group of theorists called Slocum, captured by these two researchers called Slocum Bradley, who identify 4 classic ways or classic axes, points of axes that people use to describe themselves as they position themselves vis-a-vis others. Oh, you know, I'm a Sri Lankan, and I feel the sense of family obligation, but I know that my friends back at the university don't anymore. That's a positioning maneuver. And this is the positioning diamond as used by Slocum Bradley that Kamal used to better understand how his Sri Lankan interviewees were positioning themselves and using this type of narrative to do so. Now, Kamal's a Reformed theologian, and Patrick Fung will be happy to hear that covenant was very important to his work. That's another theme that's coming out in the work of a few of those who've been speaking here over these days. He argues that if hybridity is normative, and if it's habitual in migrant or diaspora contexts, then a missiology that is informed by Jesus' command to love God and to love neighbor must imagine the possibility of locating oneself in relationship with others and not just against others. Now, what does that mean for a Reformed theologian? He responds that by using his Reformed missiology as a means of evaluating these habitual hybridization and their respective maneuvers, which are narrative, which are story-based, which are reported in accounts of I did this, I felt this, I saw that. He does so by suggesting that Reformed covenantal theology has to be an integrative theology, which creates fellowship between difference, and which catalyzes intercultural and interethnic fellowship in these contexts. He eventually arrives at some fascinating language, which I think sits at the center of his original contribution to scholarship, where he develops his covenant, Reformed covenant language, particularly as it deals with ethnicity, with the concept of what he goes on to describe as covenantal extroversion. Covenantal extroversion. Covenantal theology that is outward focused, outward oriented. And as a Baptist who's had to deal with covenant, I've seen some of the dark side of covenant, what it excludes, who are left outside. But this notion of the covenantal extroversion I find highly suggestive. In doing so, he rejects any notion that covenant identifies a Christian people with a nation, the nation. He seeks to relativize the implicit ethnicity, ethnic superiority that often accompanies these types of ethnic claims to being special. And in doing so, implicitly also critiques European normativity, because of course Europeans have had their own sense of ethnic superiority, often bound up in this sense of we are taking the gospel. Carries a certain sense of privilege, the white man's burden to civilize and to evangelize. And we need to relativize that and ask questions about what was really happening here at times. If you wish to explore that with me later, I'm happy to share stories from my own home island that point to some of the challenges that are implicit in that. At the center of Kamal's vision for this covenantal extroversion is the relativization of home and homeland. And through a turn to the ultimate other, God, he names the ultimate pattern for forms of Christian community, situating ethnicity and identitively, tensively, between the lived experience of his South Asian Australians and the theological normativity of the Reformed covenantal theology that shapes him and which he continues to explore. My fourth migrant theologian is a European theologian, and he does his work in the face of these indigenous claims, as I've already suggested, to the sense that all theology done in Australia is done in the face of the claims of First Peoples. And Chris Budden owns this language that in doing theology on Aboriginal land, all migrant theologians are undertaking what he calls Second Peoples theology. He also clearly self-critiques some of the work that has often been seen to take place in Australia. Now, of the four migrant theologies that I outline here, Budden's is the only theology that decenters and dislocates each of them. So he's very aware that these other three voices are also the voices of migrant theologians, as is his, and though they are Chinese, and though they are Samoan, a little bit closer perhaps, and though they are Sri Lankan, they are also migrant theologies, and they are migrant theologians. So they are located in some respects in the same kind of place as he is. And so he relocates all of their theologies as guest theologies that must reckon with host indigenous communities who have never ceded their sovereign claims to the lands that we now call Australia, who have been historically present in those lands probably for 65,000+ years. Budden insists that biblical narratives and lived current experiences are all essential to doing theology in context. But multiple indigenous peoples, their histories, culture, and stories suggest multiple forms of contextual theology that steadfastly resist the temptation to claiming universal normativity. And he asks the question for migrant theologians to consider: who determines that people can have a home here? Who does the welcoming? What are the conditions for homemaking, whether that be by Collier with his Mauta or others? But what are the conditions for homemaking when people live as uninvited guests on another people's land? And I think his work has consequence for other parts of the world too. Budden asks the question, how long can one be a guest? And how do you live inside an identity defined by guesthood? Budden's work indeed is an extended invitation to the margins, from where, as second peoples, we can learn to theologize inside an identity defined by guesthood, recognizing that our theology is offered as gift. It cannot be imposed. It is a theology that needs to self-locate itself to the margins and disavow all sense of privilege or normativity. It's a tough place when you arrive as a European theologian and suddenly discover there's a history that predates you by tens of thousands of years, and suddenly you're forced as a theologian to take account of that reality, as I did. It's almost an existential challenge, and one I've had to begin to process. So let me turn to the work of Thomas Nail, who, as I said, is this philosopher of movement and motion at the University of Denver. In his work, and this is the first of three in which he thinks, where he considers the migrant as a figure, the figure of the migrant. He also considers the border as a constitutive notion in the politics of motion. And finally, he comes up with the sense of being and motion in terms of human being. And in his work, he identifies four migrant figures, all of which arise in certain social conditions. He talks about the nomad who is expelled from land, territory, as a result of the territorial expansion of the agrarian population. He talks about the figure of the migrant as a barbarian expelled as a result of the expansion of the political control of the king, emperor, or despot. He talks about the illegitimate or the illegal vagabond who is expelled as a result of the expansion of legal or juridical norms that legalize the actions of the sovereign in obstructing or removing the right of others to own or work the land. And finally, he talks about the proletariat who is expelled as a mobile economic surplus or a transportable criminal workforce, Australia, as a result of the economic expansion and control of industry and business. Now, his work is helpful because it keeps the connection between the type of migrant that we may encounter and also the social conditions from which they arise. And he doesn't suggest that this is a descriptive, but it's a kind of it's a theoretical framework. It's more than a heuristic, but it suggests certain conditions out of which particular types of migrant emerge. And I've found some of this work highly suggestive and highly stimulating. And it leads, in my own work, towards considering what might it mean, as Nail suggests, there may be other figures of the migrant that he has not yet considered. It leads me in my work to ask the question, is there a figure of the migrant drawing on the work of Nail, that we could say this is a Christian, this is a figure of migrant that emerges out of particular Christian or ecclesial or church social context and conditions. And in this final section, let me very quickly spell out some of what that might mean. The monk, the missionary, allow for a different figure of the migrant, I think, to be imagined. One of particular interest to me as a missiologist, and I think particular and even perhaps peculiar to the Christian community. I want to suggest that for us, the migrant figure of the apostle is worth considering. Now this, I recognize, is not common language for many Protestants. We often associate apostles with the Roman Catholic Church. Or we may at times confess the Apostles' Creed, so there's a bit of it there. Indeed, we may even perhaps see that with the missionary characters of people like William Carey here, one of my Baptist forebears, I guess, that there was something apostolic about the nature of his early sense of being involved in Christian mission. But this is the migrant figure of the apostle that John Flett, who is a missiologist, who is Reformed, who is Bartian, and with whom I have many disagreements, nevertheless writes about apostolicity, which again is an unusual piece of work for a Protestant to write, because apostles are familiar figures in other Christian traditions, but for a Protestant, what is an apostle? What is apostolicity? And as a missiologist, how does one actually make sense of apostolicity within your missiological framework? And for John Flett, his sense is that the apostolicity resides in two key moments, two key movements, if you like. Number one is that there is the movement across some kind of border, some kind of boundary from one place to another. And then also the sense that in that new place, you become a figure who is responsible for teaching, for discipleship, for the doing of theology in that new place. Flett rejects any static understanding of apostolicity that might inform a practice of apostolic succession from one bishop to the next. It's not magic, he says. It's actually composed in the act of moving from one place to another as a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so central to Flett's idea of apostolicity is the event of cross-cultural movement and transmission. As he argues, it's basic to any definition of apostolicity. Now, in a final reflection on the decentering of European normativities, I want to address this sense that implicit in the act of contextualizing theology is a dialogue with prior normativities. You can't, in your contextual theology, intent sometimes on dethroning claims to normativity and universalism, simply ignore those historical dynamics. It's a dialogue with prior normativities. The work undertaken by Collier, by Yang, by Budden, by Weerakoon highlight new voices, new insights, new conversation partners that are certainly not necessarily central to the Western Christian tradition. And you've heard me explain something of that through the work of Yang in trying to understand theology and poetry in harmony and embrace, or Collier's use of the kinetic alternative to land-based readings of Scripture focused on ocean, or indeed in Weerakoon's description as a diasporan Reformation scholar of covenantal extroversion. Each of these speaks in new ways, and yet in continuity with the inherited Christian tradition. Sitting at the center of each of the theologians examined here is a keen sensitivity to motion, or to use Nail's term, kinesis, movement. Kinesis serves as more than a metaphor, however. It serves as a resource for biblical hermeneutics. It serves as a component in the constructive task of theology. The biblical accounts of God's people in exile may provide diasporic context that suggests locations from which various biblical human authors may have written. These generated new understandings of God and God's faithfulness. Kinesis can be used to interpret and understand a variety of human experiences. It might involve the obvious physical dislocation of people. It can be understood as cultural movement. It might involve historical movements, but it might also help us, as for Yang, understand our epistemological moves. I'm indebted to these four theologians, whose work I'm reliant upon, for supporting my argument that close attention to the consequences of migration and diaspora allows one to reveal the inherently kinetic nature, constructive nature of new possibilities, new societies, new communities, new church communities. It is the motion of people in movement that is constitutive of these new stable realities, which so often then subsequently resist the movement of people as being non-normative. But if Nail is correct, then migration, the movement of people, is indeed the normativity that has shaped our world and indeed continues to shape the churches of which you and I are so much a part. Thank you.